The bricks are still where they were laid. The doorways still open onto the same narrow lanes. The drains still run beneath the paving stones, exactly where the builders put them. Only the people are missing. No bodies were sprawled across the streets when archaeologists arrived. No homes, no weapons, no signs of the kind of violence that usually explains why a city falls silent. The houses simply left, doors closed, rooms swept, as if the people who lived there expected to come back. They did. This is Mohenjo-daro, and somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, it was one of the largest cities on Earth. Its builders were part of a civilization that stretched across more than 1,000,000 square kilometers, larger in total area than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. And yet, if you ask the average person today to name it, most would draw a blank. That silence is not an accident. It's the biggest clue we have. Picture a potter's daughter walking home along one of these streets on an ordinary evening, sometime around 2000 BCE. She passes a public well shared by a dozen households. She steps over a covered drain running beneath the street, carrying wastewater away from the homes above. A piece of engineering so advanced that nothing like it would exist again in this part of the world for over 3,000 years. She reaches her house, built from bricks that are, astonishingly, the exact same size and ratio bricks used in cities hundreds of kilometers away. Someone, somewhere, decided on a standard, and an entire civilization followed it. She has no idea she is living inside one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. To her, it's just home. Within a few generations, home will be empty. That's the mystery sitting at the center of this story. Not a war, not a single catastrophic event that historians can point to and say, this is what killed them. Something slower, something that convinced tens of thousands of people, city by city, to walk away from the most advanced urban infrastructure on the planet, and never write down why. Because that's the other half of this mystery. They write. We just can't read it. To understand how strange this disappearance really is, you have to understand what these people built in the first place. Around 2600 BCE, while the pyramids of Giza were still under construction and the city-states of Mesopotamia were locked in near-constant warfare over land and water, a very different kind of civilization was taking shape along the Indus River and its tributaries. Archaeologists call it the Indus Valley Civilization or the Harappan Civilization, named after Harappa, the first of its cities to be excavated. Its two greatest urban centers, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, sat roughly 600 kilometers apart, and yet they were laid out with an almost identical logic: straight streets, grid layouts, a raised citadel on one side of the city, residential quarters on the other. This wasn't organic growth. This planning. At its peak, the civilization is estimated to have supported somewhere between 1 and 5 million people, spread across more than 1,000 known settlement sites, and that number keeps growing as new sites are discovered. For comparison, that made it, by area, the largest of the 4 great Bronze Age civilizations. Bigger, Egypt, bigger than Mesopotamia, and almost nobody outside of specialists talks about it. Here's where the story gets stranger. In Egypt, you can walk through tombs covered in images of pharaohs going to war. In Mesopotamia, entire libraries of clay tablets record kings boasting about conquests, mass executions, and tribute extracted from defeated enemies. In the Indus Valley, archaeologists have found no depictions of kings. no thrones, no monumental war memorials, no mass graves suggesting battle, no obvious weapons of war at the scale you'd expect from an empire of this size. Instead, they found bathrooms. Nearly every house excavated at Mohenjo-daro had its own private bathing area, connected to a shared drainage network running beneath the street. A covered sewer system, complete with inspection holes for maintenance, serving an entire city. It would be over 3,000 years before anything comparable existed again anywhere in South Asia. The Romans are often credited as history's great sanitation engineers. The people of the Indus Valley were doing something remarkably similar 2,000 years earlier, with no evidence they ever needed a king to order it built. So, who were they? That question runs straight into the second great mystery of this civilization. We don't actually know what language they spoke, because we cannot read a single word they wrote. Thousands of small stone seals have been recovered from Indus Valley sites, each carved with a short sequence of symbols, sometimes alongside the image of an animal, most famously a horned bull-like creature nobody has definitively identified. The symbols appear consistently enough that scholars agree it's a genuine writing system, not decoration. But the inscriptions are short, rarely more than a handful of symbols. There's no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription connecting Indus script to a language we already understand. Dozens of attempts at decipherment have been proposed over the past century. Some researchers argue it encodes an early Dravidian language, ancestral to languages still spoken across southern India today. Others argue for links to later Indo-Aryan languages. A minority have even argued it isn't a full writing system at all, but a set of symbolic markers, closer to trademarks or religious symbols than literature. The debate remains unresolved. What that means, practically, is this: an entire civilization, at the same technological and organizational level as ancient Egypt, left us no eyewitness account of its own history, no king list, no myths in their own words, no explanation in their own voice for what eventually happened to them. We have to reconstruct their story from what they left in the ground, and the ground has a lot to say. The seals found at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa didn't stay in the Indus Valley. Archaeologists have recovered them more than 1,500 kilometers away, in the palace complexes and merchant houses of Mesopotamia, in cities like Ur. Mesopotamian texts even refer to a distant trading partner called Meluha, a name most historians now believe refers to the Indus Valley itself. Cargo moving between these civilizations included carnelian beads, ivory, timber. Remarkably, evidence suggests live peacocks and exotic animals made the journey too, prized as luxury goods in royal courts thousands of kilometers from where they were born. This was not an isolated society. It was plugged into one of the first long-distance trade networks in human history, moving goods by river, by sea along the Arabian coast, and overland by cart. Standardized weights, precisely calibrated stone cubes used for trade, have been found at Indus sites with such consistency that some researchers believe a version of that system may have influenced weight standards used later across South Asia. And then, sometime after roughly 1900 BCE, the correspondence stops. Mesopotamian references to Meluha fade from the historical record. Indus seals stop turning up in foreign palaces. Whatever thriving trade relationship had connected these two civilizations for centuries goes quiet. Right around the same time, the great cities of the Indus Valley begin to change. This is where the story of a sudden vanishing starts to complicate itself. Because the archaeological picture isn't one single dramatic night. It's a slow unraveling, stretched across generations, which in some ways is a stranger mystery than a sudden catastrophe would be. At Mohenjo-daro, later layers of occupation show a civilization quietly losing its own standards. The famously precise brickwork becomes sloppier. The drainage systems that once served entire neighborhoods fall into disrepair, sometimes built over carelessly instead of maintained. Large public buildings are subdivided into smaller, cruder living spaces. Archaeologists have found evidence some formerly grand structures were eventually repurposed for far more modest use, signs consistent with a population that either shrank dramatically or lost the specialized workforce needed to maintain the infrastructure their ancestors had built. For decades, one theory dominated: the Aryan invasion theory, which proposed that migrating Indo-Aryan peoples swept into the region and violently destroyed the Indus cities. It made for a dramatic story, and for a long time, it was the accepted explanation. But the archaeological evidence for a violent military conquest simply isn't there. No burned layers consistent with a citywide destruction event. No mass casualties in the streets. The skeletal remains found at Mohenjo-daro, once cited as evidence of a massacre, were later shown by researchers to be scattered across different periods and layers, not the result of a single violent event at all, but ordinary burials or later unrelated deaths. If it wasn't an invasion, what was it? This is where the story takes its sharpest turn, the moment that changes how you have to think about everything that came before. The Indus Valley Civilization wasn't built beside one river. It was built along a network of them, and one of the most important, flowing to the east of the Indus itself, is now largely dry. Ancient riverbeds, visible from satellite imagery today, trace the course of a once mighty waterway that many researchers identify with the seasonal Gaga-Kakra river system, a channel some scholars connect to the river described in later texts as the Saraswati. Hundreds of Indus Valley settlements have been discovered along this now vanished river's ancient course. Around the time the great cities began their decline, evidence points to major shifts in regional climate. Monsoon patterns, on which Indus Valley agriculture depended, appear to have weakened significantly across the broader region during this period. Tectonic activity may have altered the courses of rivers that fed the eastern settlements. A civilization built on precise urban planning, standardized infrastructure, and dependable seasonal flooding for agriculture would have been extraordinarily vulnerable to exactly this kind of slow environmental disruption, not a single flood or drought, but a compounding, decades-long unraveling of the very system that made cities like Mohenjo-daro possible in the first place. Crops would have failed more often. Trade routes dependent on river transport would have become unreliable. The specialized labor needed to maintain drainage systems, standardized bricks, and centralized granaries requires a population large enough and stable enough to support people who aren't directly growing their own food. Weaken that foundation gradually enough, and eventually the whole structure doesn't collapse in a night. It simply stops being worth maintaining. And so it seems people started to leave. Not all at once, not in a panic. The evidence suggests a gradual dispersal, smaller communities springing up further east and south in the Ganges-Yamuna region and further into peninsular India, some carrying forward elements of Indus material culture in diminished form. The urban sophistication faded first. Then, eventually, so did the cities themselves, left to the wind and the silt. By around 1300 BCE, the last vestiges of the mature Indus urban tradition had faded from the archaeological record entirely. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, once among the largest cities on the planet, became mounds. Locals in later centuries simply called one of them Mound of the Dead, Mohenjo-daro's modern name, with no memory left of what it had once been or who had built it. It would take until the 1920s for archaeologists to even recognize what they'd found. When British and Indian archaeologists began serious excavations at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, they weren't looking for a lost civilization. They were cataloging ruins. What they uncovered, instead, wrote the timeline of South Asian history by over 1,000 years, revealing an urban tradition as old and as sophisticated as anything in Egypt or Mesopotamia, one that the modern world had almost completely forgotten existed. That's the deeper unease sitting underneath this story. It isn't really about a civilization that vanished overnight. It's about a civilization so advanced, so vast, so quietly successful that it could disappear almost entirely from human memory, and the world would go on for 4,000 years without noticing the gap. We still don't fully agree on why the city's emptied. We still can't read the words their merchants pressed into clay and stone. We know they built plumbing before almost anyone else on Earth. We know they traded across 1,000 kilometers of ocean and desert. We know, as far as the evidence tells us, that they may have done all of this without a king standing over them demanding it. And we know that whatever finally undid them wasn't loud enough to leave a scar in the archaeological record. No burning, no conquest, just empty houses, swept clean, waiting for people who were never coming back. Somewhere in the unexcavated ground beneath modern Pakistan and northwest India, there are almost certainly more Indus Valley sites still waiting to be found. More seals, more streets, maybe even the key that finally let someone read their language for the first time in 4,000 years. Until then, the people who built one of the ancient world's great civilizations remain, in the truest sense, anonymous. We can walk streets. We can bathe in their bathrooms, if you count the reconstructions. We can hold objects their hands once shaped. But we still don't know what they called themselves. And maybe that's the real question worth sitting with. Not just why they left, but what it means that a civilization this advanced could still end up as a mystery. If the builders of Mohenjo-daro could disappear this completely, largely unremembered for 4,000 years, what does that say about how fragile even our own certainty about the present really is? What do you think really happened here?